Okay, good evening. And I have been asked to dedicate the shir Ilu Nishmas Chava Rivka Bas Azriel Shimshon Halevi, also Levi. So it's for 25th year site of someone's mother. I don't know if they want to be announced, so I won't say so, but it should be a Ilu Nishama Bizrat Hashem. Last week, I spoke in Ramat Beit Shemesh on Thursday night. I think it was live streamed through Facebook, but for those who didn't see it, we're part of it. Unfortunately, at the end of this year, I realized that one of the most important points that I had come to make actually I left out. A lot of important information was given over, but there was one particular point I really wanted to make. So I'm going to put that in tonight, this evening, B'ezras Hashem, and go over a little bit more. Was last week. It's complicated. Just for the record, that this material, all of it, is developed and written down, and anybody who wants a copy of it, I've been offering it to people who read my Parsha sheet, and anybody else who would like to get their hands in the meantime. It's called Bridging the Gap. That's what the shir is called. And you can get it from me to write to Pinchas W at Sharnun, SHAARNUN.org, and I'll put it down on the video on YouTube as well. But to begin, today happens to be still September 11th, which of course is it's now 4 years since the incident in New York, terrorists. And I was just reflecting, aside from the terrible tragedy that it was that day, but how everything changed that day. I mean, from a historic point of view, it was a big turn. It was a big turning point. It was a huge corner to turn around that there was no coming back from. Though people tried very hard to go back to the way things were before 9/11, but it wasn't meant to be. You really can't, and just like World War II on a larger scale, change things and you can rebuild and try to start anew, but you can't go back to the way things were. And who says you should anyhow? I mean, that's what history moves on. But one thing that was different, I used to travel a lot. I used to go on speaking trips to States, England, and I remember before 9/11 how easy it was. There was one trip that I went to several cities in 2 weeks' time, and it was fun. I mean, I was younger in those days, and travel was a lot more fun those days. But one thing that made it more fun was the fact that you didn't have to spend hours in security. Coming 3 hours in advance, you can come much later in the day, and and still make your flight. And there was far less checking going on, and then came 9/11, and after that, it was just the opposite. I mean, you had big, huge military people in airports in the States, and I was checked 3 times in one day. I had 3 different flights, and aside from being the regular security check, I was checked right before going on the flight because I came from the Middle East, it turned out. So therefore, I had a thing on my boarding pass every single time that they said was random, but it wasn't random because clearly I looked a lot like Osama bin Laden, and therefore they felt the need to check people like me. But he did a bad job for people with beards. But anyhow, it was like that changed everything, and I thought to myself, like, it's like incredible how it's just like this is always the case in life, where a few bad people ruin it for everybody else. 19 terrorists who pulled this thing off, evil at its worst, or maybe not worst, but pretty bad. And classic. I mean, we just had an assassination of an American senator, I believe it is, that's somewhat pro-Israel, and a politician, okay, and not a politician. What was he? So, as a part of Israel, and yeah, these cowardly acts, and this is classic. How, and yeah. I mean, what happens in Eretz Israel, but that's not where we expect it now, unfortunately, here, because we know we're at war the entire time. This is somebody who was not even Jewish, who's supporting Israel from a long time, and he gets killed because of it. That's who we're dealing with. That's what we're dealing with, and everybody else suffers. Everyone else pays the price for it. As a result of that, everybody has to go through security. And 99% of the people going through security are not a security risk. If they just normal people trying to catch a flight, going someplace, going to a store, going shopping, but everybody has to be checked because to find those few people who we do have to worry about, we have to check everybody in the meantime. And that's just, it's like we put up with it because we know it's necessary. We don't like it. It's disturbing. It's distracting. It delays things, but it's a necessary evil or good for that matter because of the situation. And this idea actually is true in Kabbalah as well. It's a very important concept in Kabbalah as well. And this is a known thing for those who learn Kabbalah, and that is that the certain lights. There obviously all of life comes down to lights, divine lights, spiritual lights. Even the secular world, which doesn't like to talk about God or divine lights, knows that everything is about light. It's all they deal in physical light, but it's just really more a metaphor for the reality of the everyday spiritual world. But it all comes into lights, and the more of God's light in the world, the more truth spreads, the more people know the truth. It's a much better place when God's light comes down to the world in abundance, b'shefa. And it can't. Why can't it? Because, which is kind of counterintuitive, but it's just the way Hashem made the world for the sake of consequence and action, free will, and all these things. It's all calculated. And the reason why he holds back his light is because if his light comes down at a time that the Jewish people are not living up to par the way they're supposed to, and the world itself has evil, rampant. Really, the klipa we call the klipas, literally, means peels, but talking about the reality of spiritual impurity. That's the source of all evil in the world that tempts us and gets us to do sins and all that. As long as that's allowed to run around the world, it feeds off the kedusha. It feeds off the holiness. It feeds off the sparks. There's only one source of energy for everything creation, for good and evil, and that's the light of God. How, why does God allow evil to use his light? For the sake of free will, for the sake of the Jewish people, that we should be able to make choices and earn our schar and be tempted by evil so we can reject it and do the right thing instead. It's all part of the plan. It's all part of mass, creation. Of course, Baruch Hu regulates it, and then he says to us that we can either increase it or decrease it. So, but to a limit, right? Hashem doesn't want his world to be destroyed. Hashem doesn't want, it's as you see, it's much easier in many respects to do a sin than it is to do a mitzvah. I mean, hopefully not really, because of the guilt and the conscience and all that. But doing a chet usually is a function of allowing yourself to fulfill a taiva, something, some yetzer hara that you have, which is like, like it's capitulating, which is, happens a lot in life. But getting up to go say Shema at a certain time with kavana, or getting up to go do another mitzvah to expend energy, that takes a large act of will, and so therefore it's tougher. So this is the way how creation works. This is what life is all about. So in order to be able to limit the impact of evil on creation, so Hashem reduces the amount of light that he allows to come into the world at this time, so that that evil itself should not be able to use it for the wrong purposes, because if they do, they could destroy the whole world and all of us, of course, at the same time. So therefore, Hashem limits it. The downside of that is there's less light in the world. So not only does evil have a limitation on how bad it can be, but we also are limited in how much light that we can get and how easily we can get it. You can still access the light, but you have to work twice as hard, 3 times hard, 4 times harder. You have to go deeper and deeper. It's the reason why once upon a time, the lesson points out, once upon a time, the set of luchos, Moshe came down the first set of tablets from Mount Sinai before he broke them. That level of Torah was so incredible that if you learned it, you automatically changed. There's no need for musar. There's no need to work on yourself. You learned it, it changed you on the spot. And not just you, but anyone else around you was affected by it too. He broke that. The level of Torah he came down with in another 80 days, another 40 days actually. He went up, came down with another 80 days on Yom Kippur, right? That basically that was the level of Torah that we now have today. And as a result of that, we can learn it and not be affected by it. We have to work on ourselves. You learn the idea and you go, Deya, Bina Vaska. We talked about that. It's also part of this idea we call Das. Das just means knowledge, but it's a certain type of knowledge. Shlomo Melech refers to it as Das Elokim, godly knowledge. But what's the difference? Why can't AI ever have Das? Why did Stephen Hawking not achieve Das? He was brilliant. He was a genius, incredible. It's awesome what he was able to do as a human being. And yet, he couldn't find God. He couldn't connect it with God. Whatever reason, right? How does that happen? How can you know so much about the world? How does some doctors, a friend of mine recently sent me a video, about the wonders of the human body, and it's about how human beings, are able to process oxygen and the amount of things, the amount of steps, the amount of stages, the amount of problems that have to be resolved just so you can take a breath or run for the bus. You know, and you watch. How is it possible? How can anyone look at this and not believe that God made man? That's the point of the video, by the way. It doesn't come off as a religious video, but clearly that's the idea. They're challenging the idea that man evolved, and it's very well done. And it makes the point. But other people will look and see the same thing and not believe. There's all kinds of doctors and all kinds of scientists who have the exact, because that's the point. Because if one group is smarter than the other group, then you say, well, that's the reason why there's a difference. If one group is better informed than the other group, and that's the difference. But they're both highly intelligent. They both possess people with high IQs. They both are looking at the exact same information and knowledge, to make their evaluations. So what's the essential difference in the end that makes it that one person sees the truth and one person doesn't see the truth? So we'll get to that, hopefully. If not today, then later on, B'ezras Hashem. But that's the direction that we're going, it's the kivun we're going. Now, I began last week talking about a mitzvah that we're all familiar with, and we just simply take for granted, including myself. I mean, I say for granted, meaning that I know it's hugely important to the Jewish people, and it's a symbol of everything we are, but I never really saw it in terms of historic reality, as a metaphor for all of history. And that's the mitzvah of bris milah, right? Bris milah, circumcision. Avram Avinu was given the mitzvah in Parashat Lechacha, right? Because Baruch Hu says to walk before me, be pure, and as a result of that, he can give birth to Yitzchak after that. But it's one of these things that you just take so for granted because it just happens all the time and it's built in, and the Torah talks about it. But it's a very bizarre thing. The idea that we have to do some kind of surgery. I mean, all kinds of cultures and cults, and have type of blood rituals and etc. We don't really go for that kind of a thing. But this one particular thing we do, which is bris milah. There's a famous discussion between Rabbi Akiva and Turnus Rufus, who was one of the Roman rulers. And he was criticizing the Jewish people for, in a sense, defaming the world of God, because God made man with the orla, with the foreskin, and that's the way He wants man to be, and therefore, why go ahead and remove it, right? Trying to do what they're doing today as well in different parts of the world to try to ban bris milah. And so Rabbi Akiva answers back and he says, "Well, do you eat the wheat from the field? Just take it right from the stalk and eat it. Like cows might do that, but do you do that, right?" And he says, "Of course not. We bake it, we take it, we grind it. It's the same thing. Why are you taking God's wheat? He didn't grind it down. He didn't make bread. He just gave you the wheat. So why? Well, because that's how food. So the same thing. So Baruch Hu is giving us a chance to participate in this wonderful mitzvah and to help perfect man. But it's obviously miyuchad to the Jewish people because the whole world didn't get it, right? And as a result of that, it became the symbol of the closeness of the relationship between God and the Jewish people. The fact that we're prepared to do this on the eighth day, as we're commanded, and showing how it's lamalam neteva. It's not a physical thing. It was a physical thing on the seventh day because that's the physical world is always represented by the number seven, right? Eight, like Hanukkah, means lamalam neteva, above nature. So therefore, the mitzvah of bris itself it's a physical mitzvah, but it's a spiritual impact. That's the main thing. And Avram got that, passed it down, and we do it. And in fact, it's such an important mitzvah that it really becomes the merit for Eretz Yisrael. Now, it's tied to the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael, and there's even a Zohar that brings down a medrash, a Zohar type medrash, about how the Sar Yishmael comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and complains. And he says, isn't it true in the schus of bris milah that Yitzchak inherited the land? And God says, yes. And he says, well, Yishmael, he also did bris milah. In fact, Yishmael did bris milah age of 13. So shouldn't he have a chelek in the land? Clearly, he wants it. And Hashem says, yeah, but he only has a mitzvah of Mila. He doesn't even have a mitzvah of Mila. He inherited from Avram Avinu and carried on with it, but he has no mitzvah to do Mila. There's no mitzvah on Yishmael to do Mila, but that's what they do anyhow, right? To their merit. And but they don't have a mitzvah of Priya. There's two parts to the mitzvah of Bris Milah since Har Sinai. There's the mitzvah of Mila and Priya. You can look up online, and Priya is what completes it. The Gemara says, and anyone who does Mila and not the Priya, which is a moving of the inner membrane, then it's called an empty bris. Doesn't count. The Mila itself is just like the severing and removing of the foreskin, but the Priya itself is a secondary part of it that is really very very primary. And the Gemara says without Priya, then Mila is empty. So therefore, Kadosh Baruch Hu says back to the Sar Shel Ishmael and says, listen, since you're right, he does bris Mila, and therefore he's kind of a schus. But since his Mila is empty because he doesn't do Priya or has no mitzvah to do Priya, so therefore he will have the land while it's empty. But the Jewish people, right, when they married it to come back to the land, they're going to have to go. It will no longer be empty because the time to come back will be then. And it doesn't say in the Medrash itself, but you do a calculation. I mean, it's quite remarkable because the official, we've been coming back to Israel actually for hundreds of years. But of course, the official declaration of the state was in 1948, right? And if you go back in history to when the Arabs built the mosque in Yerushalayim, basically took control of the area. It was the Ottoman Empire at that time, right? And around 648, that's the date that they give. So actually, it's amazing because if you subtract one from the other, you get 1,300 years, which is 100 years for every year of age that Yishmael was to when he did Bris Milah. So that can't be coincidental. And then, of course, the Jewish people come back and they've been fighting. The Arabs have been fighting to take it back, and miraculously, Baruch Hashem, we hold on to it. Held on to it. And the only part that we don't have is what we gave up. We ourselves gave over in the end. Now we're fighting to get it back. But it's this. I mean, the miracles upon miracles, not just about that, but also about the development of the country. They were still here and growing, and it's like so messianic in so many different ways. It's tied to Bris Milah, right? So why? Why is it tied to Bris Milah? And what does it have to do with the war of Gog and Magog? So there's a lot of details, and you can read a lot about it in the material if you want to get all the background information. And I can't do it all in one shear like this, but the basic idea is like this: that Bris Milah is really what paves the way for the Messianic era. Even the physical Bris Milah itself. In fact, when I first began this, this is an idea I pieced together from different sections, different ideas that I saw over the last couple of years. But actually, I recently saw a footnote by the Gra, or based upon the Gra, that explains the exact same idea. That Bris Milah is not just a mitzvah we have to do when a child's 8 days old, and symbolizes the relationship of the Jewish people to Kodesh Baruch Hu, right? Bris Milah is actually a historic process, and the reason why it's so important and why it was given to us, because it represents, first of all, it itself, the act of Bris Milah itself, is part of the tikkun process of all of history, not just the person for sure, but all of history. Every bris over the last couple of thousand years has been contributing, the Gra says, to the tikkun process of all of history, right? And then it's also symbolic or spiritually, not symbolically, but spiritually, having an even greater effect. Why? Because it comes back to this idea about these lights that can't come down in the meantime. Why are these lights so important? Because that's the difference between now and Yemasa Mashiach. The reason why there's insanity in the world, the reason why that there's so much, it's hefker, literally like it's ownerless property. People do what they want, the way they want to do it, when they want to do it, right? People think the weirdest of things, and act in the weirdest of ways of morality. The moral compass is like busted, basically, for most people. And the Jewish people themselves are divided. We are fighting against one another. We have leftists, we have rightists. The reason why this balagan exists, why I think it's just a mess, is because these lights are missing. When Hashem decides to bring Mashiach and the Messianic era begins, it's going to be because these lights come down. These lights have been held up there in the meantime, They were there for Adam Arisha in the beginning, right? He was born with bris milah. In fact, the Gemara says that as a result of his chet, he actually was moshech orlaso. He actually returned his orla. So that doesn't mean physically, spiritually, I mean, he wasn't so physical to begin with. And then he became physical as a result of the chet. So maybe at that time, it seems because of the chet, that's when the orla became a reality. Not that he had it before. He wasn't born with it. So it wasn't in the world at that stage of the game. There was a potential of good and evil, but it wasn't actualized yet. The snake himself wasn't even the Garden of Eden. In fact, the snake wasn't even infected yet with the Sitra Achra to even talk to Chava about doing the wrong thing. It was all very idyllic, all very messianic in the beginning. And then he did the chet. And because he did the chet, so as a result of that, he became physicalized, and the world became physicalized. And that's when he got the Orla. But the main reason he got the Orla was because good and evil, right, became mixed together. Evil became actualized. It became a part of the world. In fact, one of the names of the tree of knowledge of good and evil is Ilana de Sveka, the tree of doubt. That's why Haman, Amalek, they come because of the chet. Hamina eats, right? Did you eat from the tree of knowledge? Right? And the word Haman, and Gemara says is allusion to Haman, which is Amalek, and so it comes from the date of the dust of Ra and the air of Rav too. The Gra says very specifically, the Zohar says very specifically, actually, that's the source of it, that the air of Rav is mushrash, is rooted, no pun intended, but rooted in the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. That's what gave rise, and that there's lots of details here. It has to do with Adam's eating, it has to do with the tshuva he did for 130 years. It goes all over the place. On a whiteboard, it would be such a marvel to look at how many things are connected to all of this. But just right now to keep straight. In the meantime, to get to the main point, because it's going to turn out, and I'm going to say it now, so I don't forget to say it later on, like I did last week, right? It's going to turn out that the whole point of Gog and Magog, the gematria of Gog and Magog in Hebrew is 70. Right, we're all waiting for for the other shoe to drop. The final war of Gog and Magog, and there's all kinds of discussions as to exactly what is it. Right, I mean, we know what it is. It's a war with the nations that. In fact, Mashiach's arrival is the main instigation for the war of Gog and Magog. The reason why we're not fighting it yet on that level is because Mashiach hasn't revealed himself. He's in the world, right? Somebody is going to get up sometime soon, and he's going to have had enough of the situation for whatever reason, right? And he's going to be bold, and he's going to go and say and do things and get a backing and get people to follow him, and it's going to have an impact on the politics, and it's going to have an impact on history, and people are going to become aggravated and instigated, right? And next thing you know, this one thing's going to lead to another, lead to another thing, with the backdrop of Russia going to Poland and Ukraine and all these things at the same time, and all happen at the same time, because there's like certain confluence, perfect storm, to make it all, it's like when you're having a bad day, everything hurts more because everything's amplified because of the fact it's like you can become negative after a while. If you're having a good day and a bad thing happens, nish gefreilach, it's not the worst thing in the world, right? But somehow he's going to arise in the scene, and because he doesn't stand up for Klal Yisrael, for the Jewish people, it might be what's going on right now in terms of the war between the government and the Yeshiva world about going to the army. Something's going to spark something. Someone's going to get up and do something that's going to anger enough people that somehow is going to trigger a war of Gog and Magog. And they'll come to Yerushalayim. I don't know if they'll come into Yerushalayim, but they'll come. The goal will be to take over the Jewish state. God forbid, right? Rahman Islam. They won't be successful. They may have some success, according to what the Medrashim say. Right? They've already had some success already. We've already seen, victims and things happen already. But that will lead to the war of Gog and Magog. But the main point of the war of Gog and Magog is to remove the Orla from creation. Because the amount of lights that have to come down to rectify the world are 70. That's how many lights there are. The Arizal, who talks about the mitzvah of bris milah and all these lights and how the whole thing works, and have a diagram for you if you want to see it, how it's all broken up. But at the end of the day, 70 lights, these 70 lights have to come down. They cannot come down. And where if they go to? they have to go to what's something called the Teres Yesod. That's the bris milah is done in what's called the Yesod in Kabbalah. The end of the Yesod is where the Teres Yesod is, and it corresponds to 1,000 years, right? Because every sphera corresponds to 1,000 years, and the sixth millennium corresponds to Yesod because it's the sixth sphera of a unit of six of spheres. And the Teres Yesod is 1/3 of that proportion. So therefore, the first 2/3 of the millennium, the sixth millennium, the Gra explains and the lesson brings down, the Jewish people will be in exile by definition because that's only the Yesod. But the moment that the Teres Yesod takes over, so then that becomes Zman Geula. So you can, it's just mathematical, right? The difficult part about figuring out the redemption apparently is not knowing when it starts. The difficult part is recognizing it. And that's not new, right? Because you go back to the very beginning, Hashem is giving us all kinds of hints and secrets. I mean, you could read the story of Yitzis Mitzrayim two ways, one of two ways. Either you can read it like, well, that's what once happened a long time ago, and we're just reading about it, and we're the result of it, but it's not really relevant to us. Or you can read it by saying, okay, there's a clue here at the beginning about what to expect at the end. And the Gemara constantly makes these references about how there'll be a comparison. And the reality is, as we discussed before in the past, that the final redemption is not really a separate redemption, is really the completion of the first one. Because clearly it was a failure. Well, not a failure, not complete. It was a partial success, but we lost 4/5 in Makas Choshech, and we lost the 1/5 in the Midbar, except for the women, the Levim, those who came into the land. But it was not, not what it was supposed to have been. And we finally went in, we didn't conquer all the Canaanites. And as a result of that, we lost the base of Mikdash 850 years later, and we're exiled. Here we are, thousands of years later, still waiting for the final redemption. So it wasn't, it's a work in progress. Clearly, that's what it is, and that's what it was. So the final redemption is the completion of the first redemption. And of course, there were two things we had to do to be zoichet to that redemption. The Medrash says that there are two things that we use to create the proper merit. One is the blood of Korban Pesach, and one is called Dam Milah, right? The blood of Bris Milah. The Jewish people, in order to eat the Korban Pesach, had to do Bris Milah, and also later on in Yeshua's time, because they didn't do Bris Milah in the desert, for the course of the 40 years, I think they did it once, but after that, one for a period of time, but after that, probably before Har-Sinai, but after that in the desert, because it was dangerous, the Gemara says, so they didn't do Bris Milah again until they entered Eretz Yisrael in Yeshua's time. They all do Bris Milah all of a sudden. It's a very bizarre situation. But the point is that you have, the gematria of Gog and Magog equal to the amount of lights that have to come down through the Yesod to the Teres Yesod, which we're saying is 1/3, 2/3, which means you divide 1,000 by 3, and it turns out that 66.66 officially should have been the beginning of the final redemption. And I was asked last week, did anything happen specifically at that time? And the answer is yes. Well, but before we get into that point, the main point was that it could happen. Like Moshe Rabbeinu goes down to Mitzrayim and says to Kodesh Baruch Hu, "Why'd you send me? This is not redemption." And God says, "Yes, it is." And he says, "No, it got worse since I went down there." And God says, "Yes, that's what had to happen to make it. You'll see. Now you're going to see what's going to happen, but that had to happen first." So even though the redemption was really in progress, the moment the God spoke to Moshe at the burning bush, right? It was already the beginning of the redemption. Even though he's arguing back and forth for an entire week, that's all part of the process. That's why God doesn't stop it, right? And then he goes down and he fails to go back home again for 3 months, 6 months, like that. I've said different versions, but then he comes back and then everything starts to happen. The Jewish people are close to Ruach, but the plagues begin and it takes a year, and then finally the Jewish people go up. It all began back then when at a time that Moshe himself could not recognize. In fact, if you want to go back even further, the redemption began when Moshe was born, because he was born with the Organuz, and the Organuz was what's necessary for the redemption. And Miriam saw it, and Amram did it first, but then he changed his mind, and later on, he was like, but when he was born, he was the Moshiach. He was the one meant to save the Jewish people. Did he know it? No. He didn't know it till the 79th year. Right, so knowing that the redemption has begun, not a sign of anything. We don't really see that necessarily, right? So Did anything happen in 1905 that might be redemption? Like, yeah, maybe. Do we recognize it? No, but it happened. And like a virus inside of a body, right, that comes in, uninvited and undetected, right? And it sets up a little shop inside and takes over a cell, another cell. Before you know it, 1 week later, you have a virus. You got sick. Didn't happen that day, happened a week earlier. Speaking of which, right? But the works the same way by Google. But interesting enough, I did find something that was pretty significant historically. Again, it doesn't have to make perfect sense, but what I did find is the following thing, and it took a little bit of some detective work, which is always fun and always insightful because the fact that you have to go looking for it often is a sign that it's meant to be found. Because Baruch Hu, he put it there that you should find it only if you go looking for it. What did I find? So I was gonna read it originally, but it's too long to read right now. You can look it up in Wikipedia yourself. I don't even remember the guy's name. Um, if you want, I can even send you the files. But there's two files. There's one file to do with I thought it was an ambassador. It was an ambassador first, but a Japanese ambassador. Turns out it was not a Jap. He was a low-level counsel for the Japanese government who ended up in Poland as the war was, 1939. It was actually as the Holocaust was starting, and he was the one who issued thousands of visas for Jews to leave Europe against his government's wishes and other governments' wishes too. Not just that. His wife in the article is quoted as saying that we tried to contact because the Japanese government had a policy that you can't issue visas to anybody who doesn't have a final destination already set up, not in Japan, and the visa to get there. Like, we'll allow you to go through us, but not to stay here. And if you have no such plans or the money or the means to get there, we don't want you. So pretty much all the Jews didn't qualify for this type of Japanese visa, but he kept pressing his government. And they said no, right? And the last time they never got back an answer, and he put his career and his life on the line. And his wife said, "We knew we were working alone on this, but we had to do it because if we didn't, there was no time. Jews were going to die." And amazingly, when he finally had to leave to get out, right, he actually gave the stamp to refugees to falsify their own visas to get out. And that's how devoted he was to this thing. Yeah, and you're wondering, like, what is it about this Japanese, politician who would risk so much for the Jewish people? Don't forget, Japan was one of the Axis powers who were allies with the Nazi government, the Nazi party. So, what's this guy doing? Why is he so pro-Jewish, to save Jews? Is he just a humanitarian thing or something very specific, very special? That was a question I had, right? And of course, there's a book called The Train to Shanghai, or something like that is talking about some of these refugees who were from the Mir Yeshiva who survived, and therefore, because of that, they were able to rebuild the Mir Yeshiva after the war. Big, huge miracle that took place the entire time. And they set out the war in Shanghai, protected, going across Russia in a train that wasn't supposed to be built, but it was built. And again, so many stories within stories and stories, but you only have so much time to talk about these things. But one thing is clear: it was an anomaly. It was unusual, a very kind of a freak of history, if you will. Okay, so it just happened to be that around the same time I heard about this, knew about this. This is where some of the Hashgacha Pratis comes in. I came across a different book. I think it was called the Fugu Plan. But the Fugu Plan was not about what happened. I think this is just a detail in the story itself. The main point of the book was a Japanese plan to set up Jewish communities in Japan because they were hard workers and they thought they would help with prosperity, right? It never actually came to fruition, but that was the idea. And the fugu, it's called the fugu plan because the fugu fish is a fish that apparently is poisonous and you have to eat it a certain way to enjoy it, otherwise you die. Talk about dangerous diets, but that's so it's called the Fugu Plan. Anyhow, but in this book, I happened to see, and I just happened to have it. I didn't, that was like a book I bought and saw in a store, something like that, and it was on a shelf where I was, and I picked it up and I turned to a page and it's talking about this guy named Jacob Schiff. It was Jacob Schiff. I didn't know who he was either, right? But here's how the story goes. So the Japanese were at war between 1904 and 1905 with the Russians over some land in China, and they were having financial difficulties, and they were in it, they were being successful, but they couldn't carry the war for much longer, so they had to go raise money. So the Japanese ambassador, or actually the Bank of Japan, the guy who's in charge of that, he was sent to London to try to raise money from the banks, and he was unsuccessful. And he was at some party for important people, and he happened to meet this Jacob Schiff who was there, who in fact was an American banker, a very wealthy, successful American banker who met with, and they was talking, and he noticed this Japanese politician or banker, sorry, but was depressed. He was sad. He wasn't, the way he should be at such a thing. So he asked him, "What's the matter?" So he explained the whole story. How he needed the money. Now he's a failure. He can't go back to in Japan. Failure is not taken very, very well. Like suicide, not well. And he didn't know how to go back to his government. That he had not been able to raise the money, and on top of that, they might lose the war, which Japanese don't deal with very. Well, no one deals with that very well, but Japanese particularly. Anyhow, so this guy Jacob Schiff said, "Listen, I can probably get you like 5 million pounds or something like that." And but that was not enough. In the end, he ended up raising. They, by the way, they didn't do it on the spot there. They separated, and then only a few days later, I think that Jacob Schiff called him back again. He didn't take him seriously. Didn't even remember his name. He had to reintroduce himself again, but they finally met. They became best friends after that, and he not only he gave him he was able to raise $200 million, and by from his own bank, and convincing other American banks to also get involved as well and give the Japanese the money. This was seen as such an act of heroism that Jacob Schiff was invited to Japan to receive personally from the emperor an unprecedented, thing that never happened before in Japanese history, I think, and receive a certain award of honor, all in 1905, right? Now, the the ambassador, who the politician we spoke about, who gave out all the visas, he was alive at that time, right? And he would have been aware, right? The schools probably, because it was a national thing. It was a national, he was honored nationally, right? So for I don't know, it doesn't say for sure, but doesn't even say at all. But there's a good chance that the reason why this politician in the 1939, 1940, that time was open to saving Jews was because he had a recollection of what took place back in 1905. It's not because of him or because of his father, but it was probably a thing that he was aware of. And in Japan, it was a historic thing. This is all documented and recorded there. So what does it have to do with Gula? We don't know yet, but it was a significant event, an amazing, miraculous hashgacha event, because how did Jacob Schiff end up at the same party talking to this Japanese ambassador to get involved in the first place to raise the money? It's not so easy to do for war effort, especially in Japan. And eventually saving the Mir Yeshiva, right? Which leads to a Mir Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, and students, and we don't know how it's all going to play out, but at some point in the future, we may look back and say, yeah, that was the beginning of it. The same way, for example, when Pompey entered Jerusalem. What do people think? That this is the beginning of Galus Edom? Probably not, maybe, but who knows exactly when it begins, which year? It's 63 BCE. And then it turns out that Kristallnacht takes place in 1938. The Holocaust, we don't even know about a Holocaust yet. But after there is a Holocaust, then retroactively, it turns out that Kristallnacht is considered the beginning of the Holocaust, and that's exactly 2,000 years from when Pompey entered Jerusalem. Exactly 2,000 years. And that's the angel that goes up the ladder, up the ladder, up the ladder. Again, just I'm really just giving you a few points here, but it's all connected, all connected, all connected. I mean, we look at these things, yeah, it's fascinating, and we learn Chumash, and we do the Parsha Shul every single day. But as far as we're concerned, there's two different realities. There's the Bible, right? That's the one we learn. and that's the one that God likes. But it's like a story. It's like and then you have reality, the world that has United States of America, has Russia, and has England, and major players and nuclear arms, and they're not the same thing. And yet, it's the Torah that controls all of that. All of that has to fit into that, not the other way around. The world thinks that the Torah has to fit into it, but it's not true. You'll see, and it's going to come up, right? And that's what the war of Gog and Magog does. 70 lights, 70 nations, right? And those 70 lights are the difference between exile and redemption. And the only way for those lights to come down is if the world itself, a Jew, a boy, young boy, has to remove the orla to be shach to Torah. We can learn Torah without it, bris milah too, but that's what prepares him. Why? Because he's more tahor, he's more kadosh. He's less affected by the klippas because since the orla is a less pure thing, it's connected up with the reality of impurity, and therefore all the light necessary for Gula comes down to that part of the body of creation, so to speak, right, is vulnerable to be taken by the wrong side. So therefore, by taking away the orla, by doing bris milah, it's like cleaning the place up. It's like kicking out all the forces of evil. So now you can finally learn Torah, bring down the lights that are supposed to happen. 70 lights altogether. There's 70 lights. Just sitting there waiting up in Shemayim to come down. And that's why it says that when Hashem finally brings the Gula, he'll be mali the world with Deya, with das, with knowledge. Because that's what it's all about, this idea of das. So the whole, really what's going on, right, the idea of bris milah, right, is the idea of getting rid of the Erev Rav, getting rid of all those ideas, all those elements. And that's why the gematria of the word, the two words Erev Rav is equal to das, which is knowledge, because, as we know, there's Eitza das tov ra. Das Torah, das Elokim is das tov, it's das Yaakov. And das ra is das Esav. In fact, the reason why they're going to even be das ra in the first place is because 11 lights were left unrectified before at the time of creation. And those 11 lights missing are the source of the 11 chiefs of Esav and the way he thinks. And his does, and that's what's going on. The world, it's a war of das. And there might be weapons, there might be politics, there might be all kinds of other things, physical elements. But really, what this world is about today is a world of das. And as we've spoken before, there's a 1990, because every millennium is based on one day of creation. So the sixth day of creation is the basis of the sixth millennium. So therefore, the tree of knowledge of good and evil has to come back again in the future in some form. And in 1990, we started the period of time that corresponds to the hour that Adam ate from the tree, the 10th hour, right? And corresponds to the 10th hour of history. That's our period of time. This is about das right now. And this world is das starved, right? It's at the lowest point. Well, should always not say it like that, because every time I think we've gone rock bottom, it turns out there's new levels, more basement levels than I thought, right? More underground parking, right? And this is, a simon how close we are for the light coming down. But for the light to come down, we have to do bris milah, not physically. That's a mitzvah ongoing, no matter what the situation is. But bris milah and history, the orla of history has to go. Because if it doesn't, then the light can't come down. So therefore, this is a bris that we can't do. The Jewish people can't do, the world can't do. There's only one source that can do this bris in the way it's meant to be done, and that's a Kodesh Baruch Hu Hashgacha Pratis. So it really bothered me, that, it really bothered me. That's an understatement. It is much more than just bothered, right? But the fact, even had what happened on October 7th taking place one day earlier, during the 7 days on Hoshana Rabbah, for example, right? Then maybe, it's like you could see a justification, somehow, not justification, but it's a day of judgment, and it's the seventh day, the physical world. But Shmini Atzeres is a day, it's the eighth day, right? The eighth, even though it's really a holiday unto itself, not officially part of Sukkot, it's its own holiday, but somehow it's considered to be an extension of the 7 days of Sukkot, and we have a Kafes and Simchas Torah, right? But it's a day that's miyuchad to the Jewish people with the Kodesh Baruch Hu, as the Medrash says, and Rashi brings down that Shmiyat Seres is the Kodesh Baruch Hu saying, okay, up until now, it's been a holiday about the Jews and the Gentiles. Well, no, Sukkot well, when I used to live in the old city, as a bocher, I used to sit on the roof. We had an apartment overlooking the Kotel, fantastic view of the entire area. And on Sukkot time, we go up there just to look at all the people down below, and you see all these Gentiles lined up with these big, huge, palm branches, because of their idea of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, whatever you want to call them, and one of the reasons why, more than Pesach, I mean, they have Easter, but more than Pesach and certainly more than Shavuos, the Sukkot itself, because the only holiday that deals with the Gentile world is Sukkot, but in a strengthening way. In other words, we bring Karbanis on behalf of the nations of the world throughout the 7 days. Bulls, right? Oxes. We bring them, but we don't increase them in number. We start off with 13, we go down, and by the end of 7 days, altogether, there's 70 Karbanis that were brought, specifically for the Gentile world, right? The Mechaper for them, but in a reducing number to represent the reduction of their strength, which is why Sukkot is associated with Gog and Magog, because why the war takes place at that time, as we read on Yantiv, the Haftorah, because it's a time that's supposed to be when the Gentile world becomes weaker. The 70 nations become weaker in preparation for the end, and here it's just the opposite happened. And then comes the 8th day, which is Shmiyat Seres, a holiday is miyuchat to the Jewish people, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and all the nations have gone home, so to speak, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu is celebrating with us only, and this thing takes place. Tremendous blood spilled in the worst possible mutilating type ways beyond comprehension. I mean, the pictures are there, the images are there. That I think that's one of the reasons why some people can't face the truth and have to make up things like AI, aside from being able to fuel their hatred for the Jewish people in Israel. But I think they have difficult time really, thinking it's true, because it's so barbaric that the people they're supporting can be so barbaric, right? But this is the point. Take all the factors together, you put it all into a computer. Now we have AI, right? But all the factors, the good factors, the bad factors, all the prophecies from the Torah, all the prophecies in the Gemara, all the different aspects of people have said things over the years who knew what they were talking about, the Zohar, right? And then you plug in current history, all the things that have happening, the good and the bad. You ask the computer, what does it mean? And the computer would probably spin and say, well, it probably means your redemption is at hand, right? And when what took place, right? It's all part of the bris milah. Why one element and not another? Why one person and not another? Why this person this way, this one that? The same question about the Holocaust. We don't know, right? We just know what we know, and that is it took place. And that is, it was a horrific thing, again, beyond human comprehension. How can anyone ever do things like this to another human being, right? And we know that on the heels of that, we got back our land. And a person would say, how can you possibly connect one to the other? Well, maybe on a simple level you can, but on a Kabbalistic level, you certainly can, especially if the end result is going to be the final redemption. And this is really part of bridging the gap. What started me, I mean, in a sense, this is what I've been working on for decades now. But this culminates in this type of concept. The idea of bridging the gap is basically, all this Kabbalah, you have all this knowledge, all this information, all these ideas that are there. They're in the Sforim. They're talking about things as if in a laboratory, divorced of all reality. You open the Zohar, Idra Rabbi Zuta, it's all technical material. It doesn't mention this world, doesn't mention history. It just mentions what was going on to get to the point where history could exist. Like quantum mechanics, Lahavdil, where it just has a bunch of equations, doesn't get into how this produces some new material or some new, reality that makes life better or worse, right? It just mentions the equations. And then after that, the technocrats, the technicians, they work with this and they come up with new ideas and how to harness it for, to improve the quality of life. Same thing. The Zohar is, and yet here's the reality. And this reality that we're living in, by definition, came from that one. That's the mother. That's the father, right? All that Kabbalah in the Zohar and the Leshem and the Gra and the Rashash and the Svarasha Mekubalim, all of that Kabbalah forms a picture that is really what gave birth to all of this world that we're living in right now. There's nothing, as Shlomo Melch says, ein chadash tachas hashemesh. In other words, saying that nothing can happen in history, nothing that cannot be traced back to some root in all this Kabbalist information. It's the world that God made. This world can't go beyond. It's like a God said, "Oh, I didn't think of that one. That wall." It's like, when humans experiment and they do things, you can get results. I once saw something about AI and how I think Google and Microsoft or whatever these companies were working on AI and quantum mechanics, quantum computer at the same time, and something happened unexpected. They shut the whole thing down. That's what I read. But humans, they lack the prophecy, they lack the foresight to know the consequences of all the things they do. But not God. God had the creation history all worked out and to the end of it, past this moment in time, before he even started. So it's all got to be in there somewhere, but it's so distant until you start to see how these concepts come alive in history. And it doesn't change a whole lot, meaning that it's not going to it doesn't empower me to get up and go and make some major change in history. It's going to solve all the problems, but it does make it a little bit easier to deal with, and also to appreciate the impact you can have in life and what it's really all about. Because at the end, the bottom line to all of life, this concept of dust, these lights that have to come down, and anytime a person does anything at all, like we're doing now, right? To get rid of the das ra, whatever in your own head and the heads of your family when you can, and other people, anything you can do to minimize the effect of the erev rav. And the erev rav is people. It's also ideas. It's also books. It's also movies. It's all excuse me, it's concepts. It's all the orla. It's all part of the same idea. But the final bris, the final incision and removing in Priya that will finally get rid of the Orla once and for good, for all of history, that's the war of Gog and Magog. It comes, that's why it's equal to 70, because those are the amount of light that will come down after from the Das down to our world, down to the Yesod, after it's all been cleaned up. We're on track. We're on track. Everything's happening the way it's supposed to happen in the way it's supposed to happen. It's difficult to understand because, or at least to cope with, because it's not the kind of life I choose for myself. I like comfort. Before Adam ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he was completely holy. He wasn't even physical like we are today. He didn't have the same creature comforts or desire for them that we have today. He didn't have Yitzhahara. Wasn't part of him. Everything was Lashem Shemayim. Whatever God says, God, we do. And also, he didn't have to suffer because it was all being done the right way. Once he made the mistake and we inherited the Sahara and we became physicalized as we are today, right? So now pain's an issue, suffering's an issue, confusion, all these things are all a result of that. Amalek is an issue. That's the result. That the Orla came because of the Eitz Das Tova Ra. You can have an Erev Rav now because of the Eitz Das Tova Ra. And the rest of history is trying to return it back the way it's supposed to be by getting rid of it. Thousands of years later, almost 6,000 years later, here we are at the end, literally at the end, physically at the end, and spiritually at the end. We are at that point. As of 1905, according to what the Arizal says, believe it or not, whether we can see it or can't see it, that was the beginning of the final redemption. We just like the end of it. I mean, we're like the people who like to watch the movie at the end just to see the happy part. I don't want to see all the bad stuff that got to even though it leads to a good part. Who wants to see the sad stuff? Let me just see the happy stuff where they're all celebrating. That's us, right? But as the Ravad points out, that no, Gula, it's a process, right? And the beginning of the process, it might not even be recognizable at all, but it is taking place. We'll get to that point where we'll recognize it for what it is. But in the meantime, you just have to understand and know that every part of it is all part of this idea of bris milah history, we should be zeichet to be there, to say Mazel Tov, when it's all said and done, and all the evil's gone, and the oil is gone, and the Yetzer Hara is gone, and we can finally fulfill the prophecy of the world being Male Das, and everybody recognizes the Kodesh Baruch Hu, and the Kodesh Baruch Hu is king of the entire world, and that day God will be one, and his name will be one. All that will come true finally, and we'll finally see the world the way we know it's supposed to be eventually, like it was for the Mauritian back at the beginning. Shabbat Shalom and Besaras Tevis. And if for some reason we don't get a chance to speak again, Shana Tova, and Kesiva Chesiva Tova, B'ezras Hashem, and God willing, we should have a shir next week, as far as I know. But in any case, looking forward to next year too.